At 70, Martha finds herself alone and forgotten. The silence of her empty house echoes the loneliness that has consumed her for years. Her children, once a source of joy, have grown distant, leaving her to face the weight of isolation. Life has lost its color, and Martha feels like she's merely waiting for the days to pass. But when a small, starving child appears at her doorstep, abandoned and in desperate need of love, Martha's life takes an unexpected turn. In caring for this child, she rediscovers the purpose, love, and joy that she thought were long lost. Through their bond, Martha's world transforms, and together they bring each other back to life. Martha sat in her favorite chair by the window, the faint sound of traffic outside the only indication that the world was still turning. The room was dimly lit by the last rays of the setting sun, casting long shadows across the floor. She hadn't bothered to turn on the lights. There was no need. She had long since lost interest in the passing of days. Outside, the autumn leaves fluttered in the breeze, but inside, the house was as still and quiet as it had been for months. She glanced at the empty spaces around her. The kitchen, the hallway, the living room, each one a silent reminder of how alone she had become. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when the house had been filled with the sounds of laughter, the scent of fresh meals being prepared, and the warmth of children running through the halls. But now, there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick-tock of the old clock on the wall. Her children, once so eager to visit and keep in touch, had grown distant. Their calls had become less frequent, their visits fewer, until eventually they stopped altogether. Each time she picked up the phone, it felt like another moment of rejection, and each unanswered message was like a sharp reminder that she was no longer a priority in their busy lives. She had tried to keep herself busy, of course. She attended the occasional church service, went to the grocery store to pick up the necessities, and tried to keep the house in order. But the truth was, it had all lost its meaning. The days blurred into one another, and the routines she once found comforting now felt like obligations. The loneliness was suffocating. There were no visits from her children, no friends stopping by for tea. Martha had become a ghost in her own life, drifting through each day without purpose or connection. The silence had become deafening, and she had begun to wonder if she would ever feel the touch of another human being again. The thought had crossed her mind more than once. Maybe this was how it would end. Alone. Forgotten. As she sat in the chair, staring out the window, a sudden knock at the door broke the stillness. It startled her, and for a moment she didn't know whether to get up or ignore it. Visitors were rare, and she rarely had anyone to speak to, so she wasn't sure who would be knocking at this time of evening. She hesitated, her mind racing as she wondered who it could be. Perhaps it was one of the neighbors, although she couldn't remember the last time they had dropped by. Maybe it was someone selling something or asking for a donation, or... She stood up slowly, the weight of her years pressing down on her as she crossed the room. With a deep breath, she opened the door. Standing there, on the other side, was a small child. Barely 5 years old, the little one was dirty, disheveled, and thin, with eyes that were wide with fear and hunger. Martha's heart skipped a beat as she looked down at the child, unsure of what to do. The child stood motionless, gazing up at her with a mixture of confusion and trust, as though they knew Martha was their last hope. "Hello?" Martha asked softly, kneeling to meet the child's gaze. Her voice trembled, uncertain. What are you doing here, sweetie?" The child didn't respond, just clutched their small hands to their chest and stared at her, looking more lost than anything else. It was clear they were alone, and their condition suggested they hadn't eaten in days. Martha's heart broke as she took in the child's appearance: skinny arms, a tear in the tattered clothes, and a face streaked with dirt. The child's hair was unkempt, their eyes shadowed with exhaustion and confusion. It was impossible to ignore the desperation in their eyes. "Where are your parents?" Martha asked, her voice gentle but filled with concern. The child's lips trembled slightly, but they didn't answer. They simply continued to stare up at Martha, as if they didn't know how to explain what had happened or why they were standing there alone. Martha's instinct kicked in. She stepped forward, her hand reaching out to the child. "Come inside, sweetie," she said softly. "You're cold, and you must be hungry." The child didn't resist as Martha gently ushered them inside, closing the door behind them. She led the child into the kitchen where she immediately began pulling food from the cabinets: canned soup, bread, and fruit. As she prepared a small meal, Martha couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose for the first time in months. There was something about caring for this helpless child that stirred something deep within her. The little one sat at the kitchen table, staring at the food with wide, hungry eyes but too scared to touch it. Martha placed a bowl of soup in front of them, her hands shaking slightly as she sat down across from the child. "Go ahead, dear," she said softly. "You must be so hungry. Eat." The child's small hands reached out, trembling, and began to eat. Martha watched, her heart aching as she realized just how badly the child had been neglected. But at the same time, she couldn't help but feel a warmth spreading through her chest. This little one, with their wide, innocent eyes, needed her. For the first time in what felt like years, Martha felt needed again. As the child ate, Martha took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She didn't know how this had happened or why the child had ended up on her doorstep, but she couldn't turn them away. Not when they needed her so much. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It felt like an unspoken understanding. The child might not have been her own, but in that moment, Martha felt a bond forming. And, perhaps for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was doing something that truly mattered. As she watched the child eat, her thoughts drifted to the emptiness she had felt in her own life. The loneliness that had consumed her for so long seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a sense of responsibility, of love that she hadn't known she still had to give. She smiled softly as the child finished their meal, feeling a new sense of hope stirring within her. Perhaps this was the beginning of something she hadn't expected, a new chapter in her life, one that was not defined by loneliness, but by the love and care she could give to this innocent soul who had come into her life when she least expected it. The days that followed were a whirlwind of new routines. Martha, once slow and aimless, found herself moving with purpose again, each task filled with a sense of responsibility. Caring for this child became her daily focus. She made sure they had warm meals, clean clothes, and a safe, quiet place to rest. The child, whose name Martha still didn't know, slowly began to trust her, their guarded behavior softening just enough to let Martha into their world. It wasn't easy at first. The child was quiet, almost withdrawn, and there were moments when Martha would find them staring off into space, lost in their own thoughts. But gradually she learned the silent language of the child, the soft tremor in their hands when they were anxious, the way their eyes darted to the door as if expecting someone to appear. There was no one. And Martha knew this deep down. She didn't ask where the child had come from or why they were left at her doorstep. Those answers, if they ever came, could wait. What mattered now was that the child had found safety, and so had Martha. Martha's home, once quiet and still, was now filled with the sounds of life once again. The clinking of dishes, the occasional laughter that came from the child when she showed them something new, and the soft murmur of music playing in the background. They would spend their days together, Martha introducing the child to simple things she had once taken for granted, like how to brush teeth, how to fold towels, or even the joy of picking fresh flowers from the garden. Each new task brought a small sense of joy to both of them. There were moments of frustration, too. The child was still hesitant, still unsure of Martha's intentions. There were a few nights when the child would wake up in the middle of the night, crying softly, unable to sleep, their eyes wide with fear. Martha would sit beside them, gently rubbing their back until the sobs subsided. In those moments, Martha would tell the child stories of when her children were small, of family gatherings and holiday celebrations. Her voice was soft, a lullaby of sorts, meant to comfort them, even if it was mostly for her own peace of mind. Slowly, the fear in the child's eyes began to fade, replaced with the tiniest glimmer of hope. During the days, Martha made sure to keep the child engaged. They went for walks around the neighborhood, through parks where the leaves were just beginning to fall, casting a golden glow across the ground. She would point out the birds in the trees, the squirrels scampering up trunks, and the flowers that dotted the landscape. The child was curious but still hesitant, often holding onto Martha's hand tightly as they walked. It was clear that the child didn't trust easily, and that was understandable. Martha wasn't sure where the child had come from or what they had been through, but she was determined to make them feel safe and loved now. There were small moments of progress. One morning, as they sat at the kitchen table, Martha handed the child a piece of paper and some crayons, showing them how to draw. At first, the child simply stared at the blank page, not sure what to do. But after a few moments, they tentatively picked up a crayon, drawing a jagged line across the page. Martha watched quietly, her heart swelling with pride. Over the next few days, the child's drawings grew more intricate, a mix of color and lines that made little sense to anyone but them. But that didn't matter. It was a step forward. They were expressing themselves, something Martha hadn't seen in the early days. On a crisp Saturday afternoon, after a morning of playing games and reading books, Martha decided to take the child to the nearby park. It was a place she had always enjoyed, a peaceful spot with a pond where ducks floated lazily by and children ran and played. Martha hadn't been there in years, but she felt it might be a good place to help the child begin to open up. As they walked hand in hand, the sound of children's laughter filled the air. The child's eyes lit up as they watched a group of kids playing catch. It was the first time Martha had seen them show genuine interest in something outside of their immediate world. She guided the child toward the swings, and they both sat down, the chains creaking slightly as they settled into the seats. Martha gently pushed the child higher, her voice soft as she encouraged them to enjoy the moment. Slowly, the child's grip on the chains loosened, and they began to laugh. A small, hesitant giggle at first, then louder, more joyful as they swung higher and higher. Martha smiled, her heart warming at the sight of the child's face, now relaxed and filled with happiness. For the first time in days, she felt a lightness she had forgotten was possible. The park, once a place where she felt invisible, now felt like the perfect place to share this moment of joy with the child. It was during those moments at the park when Martha saw the child's first true smile that she began to feel that life had truly returned. The child's presence had filled the void that had consumed her for so long, and Martha realized that she had something to live for again, someone to care for, to nurture, to protect. At night, after their outings, the child would crawl into the small bed Martha had prepared for them, nestled under a soft blanket. Martha would sit in the chair beside them, watching as they drifted off to sleep, their small chest rising and falling gently. There was something comforting about these quiet moments, something healing in the way the child's rhythmic breathing calmed the storm that had once raged in her own heart. Martha had learned how to care for this child, but in doing so, she had also begun to care for herself again. She had found meaning in her days, a renewed sense of purpose. As the weeks passed, she noticed changes in herself. Her posture was straighter, her smile more frequent, and even the small aches of aging seemed to ease with each new day spent caring for the child. The loneliness that had once defined her existence was fading, replaced by a quiet sense of fulfillment. She didn't know where this journey would take her or what the future held, but for the first time in years, Martha felt hope. She wasn't just existing anymore, she was living again, with a renewed sense of connection. The child had come to her doorstep as a stranger, but now they were a part of her life and in many ways a part of her heart. And in caring for this little one, Martha had found the strength to begin caring for herself again. The bond between them was growing, slowly but surely, and Martha couldn't help but think that this child, this unexpected gift, had arrived in her life at just the right moment. She would give them everything she had, just as they had unknowingly given her back the will to live. And for that, Martha felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, for she knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, they would face it together. Martha was surprised at how quickly the little one was adjusting. There were still moments of hesitancy, and the child would sometimes retreat into their own quiet world. But overall, the transformation was remarkable. It wasn't just the child who was changing. Martha was evolving too. She found herself waking up in the mornings with a purpose she had long since lost. She was no longer merely passing through her days. Now, every day had a reason. The child needed her, and in meeting that need, Martha had found a reason to live, to keep moving forward. Each morning, Martha would prepare breakfast. Something simple, but with love. Porridge, toast, eggs, and juice. The child, still shy and reserved, would eat quietly, occasionally glancing up at Martha as if unsure of the safety of this new life. It was in these quiet moments that Martha would try to reassure them. She would smile, her voice soft but constant, telling the child that they were safe now. The warmth in Martha's heart grew each time she saw the child finish their meal, their small hands gripping the spoon with more confidence as the days passed. She could see that they were beginning to trust her, and though it was a small change, it felt monumental to her. The routine of caring for the child, though often tiring, became a comforting rhythm in Martha's life. She spent hours showing them how to clean their hands, how to brush their teeth, and even how to fold clothes. The child wasn't just surviving, they were learning. The wonder in their eyes as they experienced new things reminded Martha of how much she had taken for granted in her own life. She started to look at the world through the child's eyes, seeing beauty in the small things. A bird perched on a fence, the color of the sky at sunset, the feel of fresh water running through her fingers. It was as if the child was bringing the world back to life for Martha, showing her that there was still wonder to be found, even in the mundane. It was the simplest moments that brought them closest, sitting together in the garden, letting the child pick flowers, or reading a story before bed. Martha would gently turn the pages, her voice calm and soothing as she read aloud. The child would listen intently, leaning in closer as though each word was a treasure. It wasn't that the child had no words of their own. They had learned to communicate in their own way, using gestures, glances, and the occasional whispered word. And while the child's vocabulary was still limited, their eyes said everything. In those moments, Martha understood that language wasn't just spoken, it was felt, and the bond they shared was stronger than any words could express. The afternoons were spent exploring the outdoors. Martha had always enjoyed walking in the nearby park, but now it had taken on a new meaning. She loved the way the child's face would light up when they saw a squirrel running across the path or when they discovered a new flower growing in the wild. It was as if the world was opening up to them both, and Martha began to appreciate the beauty of the simplest things again. The child was teaching her how to rediscover joy, and it felt like a gift she never could have expected. There were still moments of sadness, moments when the child would gaze off into the distance with a faraway look, but Martha was there, offering a steady presence, a comforting hand to hold. As the days passed, Martha found herself feeling lighter. The weight of her own loneliness, which had once been so heavy, was now softened by the love she was giving and receiving from the child. She could see the healing beginning, not just in the child, but also in herself. Her own heart, once closed off and hardened, was opening, and with each small step the child took, whether it was reaching out for Martha's hand or taking the first hesitant steps into the world around them, Martha felt herself becoming more connected to life again. It was one of those quiet evenings as they sat together on the porch that the child did something unexpected. Martha had been talking to them, telling a story about her own childhood, when the little one suddenly climbed into her lap. Martha froze for a moment, her breath catching in her throat before she gently wrapped her arms around them, holding them close. It wasn't a moment Martha would ever have expected, and yet it was exactly what she had been hoping for. The child, now resting against her chest, let out a contented sigh, and Martha felt a wave of emotion wash over her. In that moment, she knew that this was the start of something beautiful. The child was no longer a stranger to her. They were her family now, in every sense of the word. As the days became weeks, the bond between Martha and the child deepened. It wasn't just about providing food and shelter anymore. It was about the moments of connection, the quiet conversations, the shared smiles, and the trust they had built together. Martha realized that in caring for this child, she was healing herself as much as she was helping them. The sense of purpose she had longed for was now embedded in every part of her life. Her own children, who had once drifted away, were starting to notice the changes in her. They called more frequently, and when they visited, they saw the love that now radiated from Martha. It was a love that had been rekindled, not by the people she had once expected to find it in, but by the child who had come into her life unexpectedly, filling her world with the possibility of new beginnings. One afternoon, when the child was napping peacefully, Martha sat quietly in the living room, reflecting on the journey they had taken together so far. She could hardly believe how far they had come, from the child's first hesitant steps into her home to this moment, where they had built a life together, one small step at a time. Martha had begun to feel that the child had healed her more than anyone else could have. She had gone from being a woman who felt invisible, forgotten by her own family, to someone who was needed again, who had found a reason to live with passion and purpose. Martha stood up and went to the window, looking out at the familiar view of the garden and the street beyond. It was a peaceful scene. Nothing extraordinary, but somehow, everything felt different now. The child's presence had brought warmth back into her life. For the first time in a long time, Martha could see the future again, not as an uncertain blur, but as a path leading toward more love, more laughter, and more moments of joy. She wasn't sure what the future would hold for them, but for the first time in years, she was no longer afraid. With the child by her side, anything was possible. She smiled softly, watching the sunlight filter through the trees, and whispered a silent thank you to whatever force had brought the child into her life. In this simple, unexpected way, Martha had found the strength to embrace life again, and she knew that together they would face whatever came next. No longer alone, but united by love. The weeks continued to slip by, but for Martha, each day felt more significant than the last. She had begun to realize that her life had fundamentally changed. It was not just the routines of caring for the child that had become so deeply embedded in her being. It was the profound connection they shared. The child, once withdrawn and guarded, had begun to bloom in front of her eyes. Their laughter was no longer rare, but frequent. Their eyes, which once darted around nervously, now held a certain confidence. In the mornings they would run to her, arms outstretched for a hug, a silent request for reassurance and warmth. And Martha, her heart swelling each time, would gladly hold them, providing the comfort they had so desperately needed. Martha had started to think of herself not just as a caretaker, but as a guide. She was the person who would show this child the world, one small step at a time. She was no longer the lonely woman who had quietly resigned herself to her isolation. She was now filled with purpose, grounded in the knowledge that this child was counting on her. It was a weight, yes, but a weight she carried willingly. The child's needs, their gradual, constant trust, and the unconditional love they gave her were far more than she could have imagined. Every smile, every moment of joy shared between them, felt like a quiet triumph over the loneliness that had previously consumed Martha's life. Together, they began to explore their world even more. Martha introduced the child to the joy of baking, something she had always enjoyed but had long forgotten to indulge in. They spent hours in the kitchen, flour dusting the countertops, sugar scattered like tiny grains of hope. Martha would mix the dough, and the child, with their small hands, would help roll it out, their eyes wide with wonder at the process. There was a beauty in the simplicity of these moments, a shared activity that connected them, not just to each other but to the happiness of creation. They would sit together at the table, sharing their freshly baked treats, both of them savoring the sweetness that filled their hearts as much as their stomachs. The laughter that echoed in the kitchen had become a soundtrack to their lives. The child, who had once been so reserved, was slowly showing more of their personality. Their face would light up when Martha tried to make silly faces or when she made up funny names for their baked goods. It was clear that the child was no longer just surviving, but was starting to live, starting to understand that the world around them could be safe, nurturing, and full of kindness. But it wasn't all sunshine and happiness. Despite the child's growing trust and the love Martha had given, there were still moments when the past crept in. There were flashes of sadness in the child's eyes, moments when they would withdraw, unsure of their place in the world. Martha would sit by them, gently stroking their hair or holding their hand, trying to reassure them. But it was in these quiet moments of vulnerability that Martha realized just how deep the child's scars ran. The child had endured things she could only imagine, and while Martha could give them a loving home and a stable foundation, there were parts of the child's spirit that only time and their own strength could heal. One evening, after dinner, as they sat on the couch together, the child curled up beside her, Martha found herself reflecting on how much she had changed. She no longer felt that sense of emptiness that had once haunted her every waking moment. It wasn't that she had become perfect or that her life had become free from challenges, but she felt as if the purpose she had longed for had finally arrived. The child, sitting beside her now, was her anchor. They had become her family in a way she could never have anticipated. As the child's small head rested against her shoulder, Martha felt a sense of calm that she had not experienced in years. The days grew longer as spring began to bloom. The garden, which had once felt like a barren reminder of the quiet and solitude in her life, now felt alive with possibility. The child loved to help Martha in the garden, picking weeds, planting flowers, and even attempting to grow small vegetables. Their hands, still small and unskilled, grasped the tools with determination, mimicking Martha's every movement. They laughed when the soil would stick to their little fingers or when they accidentally spilled a watering can. But it was this shared experience that solidified their bond. It was more than just gardening. It was about growth. Both Martha and the child were growing, each in their own way, helping each other to heal. With the arrival of summer, Martha decided to take the child on their first real outing outside the neighborhood, a trip to the beach. It had been years since Martha had felt the sand between her toes, the sun on her face, and the refreshing touch of the ocean breeze. As they walked along the shore, Martha marveled at how the child reacted to the waves crashing against the sand. The child's eyes grew wide with awe as they watched the ebb and flow of the ocean. Martha could feel their sense of wonder, and it filled her with a deep sense of peace. They were both experiencing something new, and for a moment, it felt as though the weight of the world had disappeared. It was just them, the child and the woman, walking along the shore, sharing a moment of pure, unfiltered joy. As the summer continued, their adventures grew bolder. Martha took the child to the zoo, to art galleries, and even to a local carnival. With each new experience, the child's confidence grew. They began to hold Martha's hand less tightly, as if venturing out into the world on their own terms. The first time the child ran off to explore the playground at the park without looking back at Martha, a pang of sadness hit her heart. But it was a bittersweet feeling, because in that moment, Martha knew the child was becoming their own person. They were growing. They were learning to trust the world around them. And they were beginning to trust themselves. One afternoon, while at the playground, Martha saw the child laughing with other children, their small face filled with pure joy. It was a sight that brought tears to Martha's eyes, tears of pride, of love, and of bittersweet joy. She had seen this child move from a place of fear and uncertainty to a place of warmth and possibility. And in doing so, she had also seen herself grow. She was no longer just a lonely woman, holding on to the past. She was someone who had found love again, someone who had found strength in the presence of a child who needed her as much as she needed them. Martha couldn't help but smile as she watched the child, laughing freely, their world expanding more each day. She knew that they still had challenges to face, that healing was an ongoing process, but they were no longer defined by their pain. Martha realized that the child had taught her something invaluable: the power of resilience, of finding joy in the small moments, of learning to trust again. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. As the evening approached and the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, Martha felt a sense of deep gratitude. She had found a new family, one she had never expected, and it had transformed her in ways she never thought possible. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, truly living. And as she looked at the child, now running back toward her with a grin stretched across their face, she knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. And that thought gave her more peace than she had ever known. As the months passed, the connection between Martha and the child only deepened. Every day they found new ways to bond, and every day they shared experiences that made their relationship even stronger. The child had truly become the center of Martha's world, and in a way, Martha had become the foundation for the child's world, a safe place where love, warmth, and understanding were the constants. The loneliness that had once clouded Martha's life seemed like a distant memory now. She was living a full, meaningful existence, one that was defined not by the absence of people but by the presence of someone who needed her as much as she needed them. Martha could see the transformation in the child, too. The child, once so withdrawn and unsure, was now laughing, playing, and speaking more. They were opening up in ways Martha had hoped for but had never expected to happen so soon. It wasn't just the trust that had developed between them. It was the shared experiences that had shaped the child's understanding of the world. Each adventure they had, whether a trip to the park, baking together, or simple moments of reading, had been steps toward healing for both of them. They were creating memories that would last far longer than the fleeting moment of despair that had brought the child into Martha's life. But as the child began to blossom, Martha found herself facing a new challenge: the gradual shift of roles. As the child became more confident and independent, Martha had to come to terms with the idea that one day they would need her less. It was a bittersweet realization, a sign of growth and healing, but it also stirred up a sense of fear deep within her. What would happen to her once the child no longer needed her in the same way? What would life look like then? The fear crept in quietly, as fears often do, taking root during the quiet moments when Martha was left alone with her thoughts. What if the child grew up and moved on, leaving Martha to once again face the vast emptiness that had defined her life before? She was still an older woman after all, and the years had left their mark. The thought of returning to the solitude she had fought so hard to escape was terrifying. And yet, Martha knew she couldn't hold on to the child forever. The child had their own life to live, their own future to embrace. Martha's role was to give them the tools to navigate the world on their own. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch watching the sun set behind the trees, Martha found herself lost in thought. The child, now 7, was playing in the yard with other kids from the neighborhood. They ran and laughed, their voice rising above the others in pure joy. Martha smiled, her heart swelling with pride, but also tinged with that quiet sadness. She had done her job. The child was no longer the small, fragile being who had once come to her broken and lost. They were a thriving, vibrant little person, and Martha had given them the love and stability they needed to reach this point. But as she sat there, lost in her reflections, the child came running up to her, their face flushed with excitement. "Grandma! Grandma!" they shouted as they reached Martha's side. The child had started calling her Grandma months ago, and Martha had initially been surprised, but it had warmed her heart to hear it. They had no other grandparents, and, in a way, Martha had become the one who fulfilled that role. "What is it, sweetheart?" Martha asked, her voice soft with affection. "I made something for you," the child said, holding up a small, slightly wobbly clay heart, painted in bright, cheerful colors. It wasn't a perfect piece of art, far from it, but to Martha, it was a masterpiece. The child handed it to her with such pride, their eyes gleaming. Martha took the heart in her hands, feeling the rough texture of the clay, the colors vibrant against her skin. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, not from sadness but from pure love. This little person had transformed her life, and now they were showing her love in return. "Thank you," Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. She hugged the child tightly, feeling the warmth of their body against hers, the sweet smell of their hair. "You're the most special thing that's ever happened to me." The child smiled, their small hand resting on Martha's cheek as if to reassure her. In that moment, Martha knew, without a doubt, that she had done more than just take care of the child. She had given them something more invaluable. She had given them the confidence to live a full life, and in doing so, she had found a new way to live herself. She wasn't afraid of the future anymore because the future, with the child by her side, no longer felt uncertain. The future felt like a promise. As the child continued to grow, Martha's love for them only grew stronger, and as they both faced the changes that would inevitably come, Martha found herself more ready than ever to embrace whatever lay ahead. She was no longer a woman defined by the quiet solitude of her earlier years. She was a mother, a grandmother, a nurturer, and a woman whose heart had been opened by the unexpected arrival of a child who had needed her as much as she had needed them. One day, Martha sat on the same porch where she had spent so many quiet hours watching the sunset, just as she had done so many times before. But this time, the sunset was different. The sky was painted in hues of gold, pink, and lavender, and as Martha sat there, her thoughts turned to the future. She had watched the child grow from a frightened, withdrawn soul to a confident, joyful little person. And now, as Martha looked at the child playing with their friends across the street, she realized that they would grow up to do great things. They would go to school, make new friends, and eventually leave the nest, but they would always carry with them the lessons Martha had taught them: love, kindness, and the importance of cherishing the simple moments of life. Martha was no longer alone. She had found something in the child, a connection that had filled her life with meaning. She had found a new purpose, one that had nothing to do with what the world expected of her, but with the love she had to offer. She had given the child a second chance at life, and in return, the child had given her a second chance at happiness. As the night fell, Martha closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude. The future was uncertain, but one thing was certain: the love between her and the child would remain, unbreakable and steadfast, for as long as they both had breath in their bodies. The loneliness that had once consumed her was gone, replaced by the sweet joy of knowing that no matter what, they would always have each other. And that was more than enough. Martha smiled, knowing in her heart that she had lived a full life, one that was defined not by the years that had passed, but by the love that had been shared. With the child beside her, she could face whatever came next, knowing that they had already overcome so much together. And as she looked out at the darkening sky, she felt at peace, ready for whatever the future would hold.